Hello, everyone. My name is Natasha Belousova, and today I'm going to talk to you about common sense in methodology in modern ELT, or maybe lack of common sense in methodology. Well, we all combine different expertise in our lives. I do too. I'm a teacher of English, I'm a teacher trainer, a university lecturer, a course designer, a yoga expert, and also in my second life, I'm an aerial gymnast. And all these areas of my life, I try to look for common sense. But what is common sense? And how common is common sense? This is what we're going to think about today with you. And as many heads are better than one, I'm going to pick your brain a little bit, if you don't mind.
Хотите постоянно развиваться в преподавании иностранных языков? Школа Дмитрия Никитина проводит образовательные тренинги, конференции и курсы для преподавателей. Подробности о событиях можно узнать по ссылке в описании.
So now, could you please use your common sense and answer these questions, the questions that you can see on the slide. Answer them in your head. Think a little bit about them. So, what makes your learning effective? What is a no-no for you as a teacher? And why? While you're thinking about all this, also think how important choice of a method or an approach is for making your teaching effective. Where would you place it on a scale of 1 to 10? I know they're all very tricky questions and answers can be very different, but as we're thinking about methods and approaches, which should be of some importance, we think, let's actually remember some methods and approaches that are most often used and most often talked about. I'm going to show you a few pictures. Look at them and try to recognize a method or an approach. There could be different answers possible. So here's the first picture. What do you think? What does it look like? Well, I think that what you can see here, all these students working together and discussing something actively, and we can't see the teacher here really, probably reminds us of a group of methods called communicative methods. And it is a group of methods. So we can talk about communicative language teaching or task-based language teaching here, or probably even content-based instruction or CLIL, content, language, and integrated learning, where students don't only learn a language, but they also learn a subject in this language, like, for example, history in English and so on. So this group of methods was developed somewhere between the 1960s and the 1990s of the 20th century. Now, let's look at another picture. It's completely different, isn't it? We can't see people here at all. So what do you think? What is it about? I think you recognize the lexical approach, which is very, very popular here. I noticed that there are no people here because the lexical approach belongs to a completely different group of methods, which is called linguistic methods, and it was developed in 1993 by Michael Lewis. And here the idea is that language is not that much a social tool, but it's rather a system and a property of people's minds. So this method, it's not even a method really, if you think about it, but it was driven more by linguistic theories. Okay, let's look at another one. It's going to be completely different, I promise. How about this one? Do you recognize it? Okay, this is, I'm sure you know, total physical response, or TPR, and it belongs to another group of methods, which are called natural methods. And here, the idea is that a method of teaching tries to imitate how the first language is learned, so without really much instruction. And finally, how about this picture? Do you recognize the whiteboard? I think we all have seen it in schools and universities. I mean, if you're older than 18, probably. Even if you were 18. So it does look like grammar translation, doesn't it? No context, just words. And it's another linguistic approach. And I don't know if you will believe me, but people started talking about it back in the 19th century. It's still here though. So, I mean, you see that things that are used in classrooms everywhere are so different. Like there are different groups of methods and approaches. So the question is how to choose between them all. By the way, you can read more about all these methods and approaches in these books if you're interested. So how can we choose the best teaching methods or approach? Should it be the latest one or the newest one? Because it seems to be probably the most advanced. Or should it be the most fashionable method or approach just because it's fashionable? How reliable do you think these criteria are for choosing a method or approach? Well, let's look at the evolution of teaching methods a little bit, but it's not going to be the evolution which is based on the time when a method was developed, but also it's the evolution with the idea of fashion in mind, okay? So here we go. With the idea of fashion in mind, I have put the lexical approach here because of its triumphant comeback recently, even though it was invented in the back in the 20th century, it's quite long ago already. And then here I've put task-based teaching because it's quite new and recent, and people use it a lot. And one of the communicative approaches, clearly there as well. Communicative language teachings, they're more like communicative methods, and it's the bulk of our evolution because they were a huge change when they appeared. Then TPR, and finally grammar translation. So here we go. Here's the evolution, all right? But again, do you think there is a clear link between the effectiveness of a method and how fashionable and how new it is? So let's check your intuition, all right? We're going to have something that I have called a beliefs quiz, and I'm going to show you a few teaching principles formulated by different people, different books at different times. So if you agree with a principle, say agree to the screen, right? If you disagree, say disagree loudly, and also think whether you think this idea is new or old. So whether it's associated with some of the recent approaches, fashionable approaches, or it's an old one. So let's see if you can guess. So I'll just remind you that we're trying to figure out this link between the effectiveness of a method and approach and how new and fashionable it is. So here's the first one. What do you think? Never translate, demonstrate. So do you agree? Do you disagree? Is it new, old? What do you think? Well, I hope you disagree, to be honest. And I hope you understand it's quite old because it's more like it's associated with the Berlitz method developed by or popularized by Maximilian Berlitz at the end of the 19th century. So yeah, it's old and it's more about drilling. So no, we would say that's it's a no. How about this one? What do you think about this idea? It's quite long, so I'll give you some time to read through. Even though someone who writes about it in a book on methodology doesn't use the word relevance, you can still see that there's a lot about relevance here. So what do you think? Is it a good idea? I think it is a good idea. And do you think it sounds quite recent? We keep talking about relevance of a method or approach to our students a lot now. What do you think? Is it a new or an old idea? I'm sure it's very difficult to guess, but because it does look new, but it was published in a book of methodology by someone called Goldschmidt back in 1923. Just imagine. So, this idea, which is, I think you agree with me, which is a good idea, was formulated long before any of the methods and approaches we've just looked at appeared. Now, this is amazing, isn't it? So people talked about very good, very important things in teaching, something that we keep coming back to a lot long ago, at the beginning of the 20th century. Goodness, it's 1923. Look, it's 100 years ago. Now, let's look at the next one. What do you think? L1 is also a debatable question. So what do you think? That's a comparison between the target language, the language the learners are actually acquiring, and the students L1 is encouraged. I'm not sure you will guess, but look, this idea is associated with the lexical approach, and it was formulated there by Michael Lewis in 1993 in the original version. So, I mean, not only in the original version, and people who popularize this approach, like Hugh Deller, they keep talking about it, and it is not a bad idea. I mean, if you know, of course, why and how much of L1 should be used in class. Doesn't it remind you of something that's been recently discussed everywhere? Things like mindfulness or being gentle to yourself, this idea of creating a stress-free environment. Isn't it a good idea generally? I mean, if you think about some things that happen in our students' lives, like YGE, for example, it doesn't apply in a stress-free environment. But sometimes, do you think it's a good idea just to try and help our learners overcome certain psychological barriers they have towards a language and towards language learning? So anyway, do you think this idea is new? I'm sure you will be a little bit surprised to find out that this idea is associated with one of the alternative methods called Suggestopedia, which was suggested by Georgi Lozanov. It's a Bulgarian scientist in the 1970s, also quite long ago. So, actually it sounds quite recent. So you see what we have here when we've looked at all these ideas, that people have been talking about good ideas, good teaching, and suggesting some good ideas throughout the history of ELT. And some good and reasonable things are not necessarily associated with a method or approach being recent, being new, being fashionable. And some things seem to have been forgotten. And then people come back to them. So see what we have. So probably the criteria of being new and being fashionable are not very reliable in terms of choosing a method or approach. So maybe if these two are not reliable, we should opt for the most traditional one. At least this one is going to be, tried and tested and no problem with this. Not sure. And what shall we do with all this? Look, I mean, the green ones are the most popular, methods of approaches. But then we have dictogloss grammaring, the drama approach, programmed instruction, and all these things keep appearing. Goodness, very difficult, very difficult. So, when I've been thinking, what I've been thinking about for a long time and thinking about all this, I decided to look at a very, very important distinction to make probably our life, the teacher's life, a little bit easier in terms of choosing methods or approaches. So let's have a look. Here you can see, I think, a very, very important distinction between something we called a method and another term, which is methodology. So, if you look through the definition, I'll give you a couple of minutes for this. You can see that a method is actually a very prescriptive, sort of limiting thing, because it says that if the teacher wants to use a method, let's say Suggestopedia or task-based learning or something else, TPR, they have to stick to all the principles that this method suggests. So you can't really walk away from any of this, because a method is a system. And look at the definition. It says teachers are to follow this principle. So it's quite strict, you see. So a method is actually a very prescriptive thing. Whereas if you look at something we call methodology, it's a much more general term. And I really like the definition suggested by Scott Thornberry in 2017, which is basically methodology implies using different techniques, different activities, different classroom procedures and task setups. And it doesn't matter which particular method or approach, which was developed at a certain time in history, they're originally associated with. So methodology, I think, is associated with freedom in my head. Like, it allows the teacher to use whatever they like, mix and match, of course, and thinking of good teaching and the students' needs. So I think it makes sense to operate this term, methodology, instead of a method. Also because, basically all this evolution of teaching methods we've just talked about has ended up in a trap, because talking about where we are now, the age, the stage of this methodological development we are now in, many people talk about something called the post-method era. Post-method, notice. And this post-method era we live in and we teach in is associated with the following characteristics. So people talk about this post-method condition, about the death of method. Goodness, we've just said that they're quite important, of some importance. Principled eclecticism, it means that, what we've just said, we can mix and match bits and pieces of different methods and approaches, but it's going to be principled only if you know why. And also, I think this is also an important thing, the replacement of methods by the era of textbook-defined practice. So what this writer means is that, very often when a teacher teaches somewhere, they're given a book and they can't choose a course book. And so very often course books sort of imply a certain method or approach. And, you have to do something about it. Very difficult. That's a very tricky situation.
Хотите постоянно развиваться в преподавании иностранных языков? Школа Дмитрия Никитина проводит образовательные тренинги, конференции и курсы для преподавателей. Подробности о событиях можно узнать по ссылке в описании.
And now, this question probably is not relevant anymore. And a more general question is relevant. What shall we do with all this? And again, I was thinking about it for a while, and then I found a fantastic idea, in my view, suggested by Scott Thornberry. So I think that he actually produces quite a lot of good ideas. And here it is. Have a look. There's going to be a bit of theory here. So if we think that a method or approach, take any, is sort of defined according to a few parameters, you can see them on the left, okay? This is where the background is yellow. It's the idea of the nature of language and also how this language is acquired, and also, of course, goals and objectives in teaching and roles of teachers and learners and different activities and techniques people use. So these are different parameters, okay? So then basically he says, again, using the word methodology, all these methods, most of them, I think all of them actually, they sort of fall between a very simple dichotomy. So you see, on the left, you can see form, a focus, where it means that people prioritize, probably grammar and how sentences are constructed and everything, or, in terms of the way the teacher not even explains, but clarifies how the language is used. This could be some kind of an analytic approach, which implies explanations, things like that. Then, again, on the left, this end of the dichotomy, the focus is on accuracy, so using grammar and lexis and phonology correctly. And also the focus is on the system, and we have different systems like grammar, lexis, phonology, discourse. And again, the approach of the teacher is transmissive. Transmissive, that means that the teacher actually tells the learner what to do and how to do things. So there's no dialogue in the classroom. And the approach is deductive. So I tell you what to do, you do it. Yeah, so first I explain, then you practice. And also notice that this end of this dichotomy actually allows the use of L1. Yeah, that's why the approach is bilingual. On the right, we can see the opposite situation, basically, because again, these are extremes, okay, here. And so on the right, we can see the main focus on function or meaning of the language more, the experimental approach to the language, where learners are allowed to experiment with the language and actually make mistakes and so on. Then communication is the key, and the focus is on skills, because here we can we'll look at the language as a social tool more, and then the approach is dialogic, and the learners are allowed to sort of play an active role, co-constructing what happens in the classroom. The approach is more inductive, so it comes from practice to theory, and monolingual. So it means that L1, or own language, is sort of almost excluded from the classroom. So people try to communicate in English all the time. And so these are extremes, okay? And if we think in terms of methodology rather than a method, we can actually place different methods, between these two extremes. So for example, if you look at the left column, what do you think? Which of the methods is actually associated with this extreme view, form, analytic, accuracy, system, So I would think about grammar translation here, because it sort of combines all these characteristics. And if you look at the right column, so which method is associated with this extreme? So probably communicative language learning, where language is a social tool. It might make difficult to pass IELTS well, but it's a lot of fun, obviously. So if you take all the different methods and approaches, you can just stop thinking about them in terms of following one of them, but just see which things from different methods you want to take depending on the student's needs. And depending on the student's needs, you can move along this line, either closer to form or closer to function, closer to the analytic approach or closer to the experimental approach, and so on. So for example, if your learner lacks grammar control, for example, you might think, right, we need to do a bit of form with the learner. Maybe not all the time, but sometimes you do need to do it. Or if the learner isn't aware of the meaning of grammar, because probably the predominant method has always been grammar translation, then you could think, we need to do more meaning work and you want to focus on function. Or let's say, if your learner is afraid of speaking, you could prioritize communication rather than accuracy and allow the learner to make errors for some time, and then decide, okay, we'll do something about them later, but communication is key. But if your learner is, on the contrary, fluent but not accurate, again, you can prioritize accuracy here. So let's play a little bit with this dichotomy and see how it can be actually used in real life. I'm going to show you 3 profiles of real students, okay? Look at their profiles, think about their needs, and decide where you would put these red crosses, okay, on this scheme with this dichotomy. So we're going to try to find some common sense, right? Which is, as you see, not that common. It's always individual, it's common sense for an individual learner. Anyway, so here's the learner profile. This is a YG person, a teenager, fluent speaker, but lack of grammar control and all language interference, which is, a common case. So would you prioritize form or function with this kind of learner? Think for a couple of moments, please. Would you focus on accuracy more or on communication more? Would you use L1 in the classroom with the learners? Is Russian allowed if it's a Russian learner? So this is what I suggested. I would focus on form because of the lack of grammar control. I think that you have to be somewhere in the middle with being analytical, experimental, focusing on accuracy and communication, because all these things are needed for the exam. Systems and skills are both important. Sometimes you could be more transmissive, sometimes allow the learner to make choices. And probably I would use Russian with this learner sometimes to help them overcome, this own language interference. How about this profile? That's a completely different situation. So it's an adult learner, general English, you can see. And it's very difficult to identify the level of this learner because of their vast vocabulary, but non-existent grammar. We can guess why it's happened, because probably the learner keeps speaking English in their company, but they've never actually had any formal instruction in terms of grammar. So what would you do? What would you prioritize again? Think for a second, and I'll show you what I have decided. So as I can see, I would prioritize form again, but I might be more dialogic here because the learner sort of knows what they need. And I would like to really be very, very careful listening to what they say and changing the approach to our lessons depending on the changing needs. And I would be probably more monolingual because I can understand that this learner doesn't have any problems understanding English or using vocabulary. But anyway. Finally, there's a young learner for you here. They're 8 years old, so just beginning to study English, studies English at school. And I think you can guess that, well, if we, again, show some common sense, the situation should be completely different. Yeah, because you don't really focus on form that much with young learners, and you teach English as chunks, grammar chunks, focusing on meaning more and communication. And you can't be analytic because of the age, and you just allow the learners experiment with the language more. And you have to be in the middle in terms of accuracy and communication systems and skills and so on. Probably you can be monolingual easily because there's no L1 interference. So why use Russian, and the material is easy, so you can easily use only the target language in the classroom. So if you look at these 3 examples, you can see that, you can't really be limited by one approach, because one approach is one extreme. And, we've just looked at different profiles of people, and for each parameter, you have to move here and there, which implies that you need bits and pieces from very different methods and approaches. So again, it means that it's a good idea to mix and match, isn't it? Of course, if you know why you're doing it and you think about the learner's needs. This is principles of eclecticism. Well, to get some more information of this, more opinions in this, I decided to interview a couple of my colleagues who are also teachers and teach trainers. And I recorded bits and pieces of their interviews. I asked them one question: how do you choose the same question, a teaching method or approach in the post-method era? And I'm going to let you listen to their voices, because I think, it's interesting to compare what you believe with what other people believe. And notice that these teachers and teacher trainers, they all teach in very, very different contexts, okay? And they work in very different environments. So let's see if their opinions are similar or different. So see you in a couple of moments. So far, just listen to what they say.
Honestly, I do not think I operate methods or approaches when I plan my lessons. Basically what I do, I stick to a certain number of techniques which I'm familiar with and which I probably like.
So I try to choose something that is good for this particular case, and I also try to choose something that is realistic and meaningful for the student and for the real life.
And so basically, a teacher takes what's best to suit the needs of her or his particular group. of students. So if they really love their grammar explanations, well, why not give it to them?
Our choices must be SMART. And SMART, the word SMART is an acronym here, where S stands for students and their needs. M is for management, so how effectively you can manage the process, all the processes. A is for assortment or variety. Yeah, so we should remember we should provide our students with a variety of skills and systems, materials and techniques and so on. R is for reasons, and every teacher must understand why. So they have chosen these or that, so for their classroom, for their students. And T is for thinking skills.
Are we really in a post-method era? Look at course books. They're still founded on some sort of method.
So you see, even though these people teach in very different contexts, they're unanimous about one thing, that there's no point in limiting yourself to one particular approach method because it can't really cater for all our learners' needs. And it's important to understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how the things you do in the classroom, doesn't matter which method approach or which methods or approaches, can help all learners achieve their goals.
Хотите постоянно развиваться в преподавании иностранных языков? Школа Дмитрия Никитина проводит образовательные тренинги, конференции и курсы для преподавателей. Подробности о событиях можно узнать по ссылке в описании.
And this is my final advice. At least this is what I think is a good idea for teachers. So first, especially for young teachers, because you don't want to say to a young teacher, go with the flow or, use your gut feeling, because there's no gut feeling yet. So I would recommend just to choose a couple of methods they like and to think these methods can help the learners, and just stick to them for a while and then start gradually experimenting with other things, learning about new methods and taking some interesting activities and classroom procedures associated with them, mixing and matching. Then again, think about teaching not in terms of a method, one strict method, but in terms of methodology, which is good, where methodology is just good teaching. And be rigorous, understand what you're doing and try to be knowledgeable, but don't be rigid again. Mix and match and try to make it principled. It means that you should always answer the question why you do things that you do. If you can't answer the question why you do it, don't do it. And just remember, the fashionable might not fit with the learner's needs. And so even if a teacher is given a course book, which implies a certain method, again, I think that it's important to remember that the teacher is better than the book, okay? Because the teacher knows the learner's needs and you can always tweak something using a course book because it's like a cookbook, not more than that. And finally, I'd like to show you a quote that I found in a book I've recently read. This book is called The End of Average. And, even though this quote in this book is about the aviation industry, I think it could easily be applied to ELT. So the idea of average, averagely, can we say it, effective method or approach, doesn't seem to work. So if you want to design something for an individual human being, and each student is an individual human being, the average is completely useless. So, and then common sense is very, very individual. Thank you very much for listening, and feel free to contact me. Bye-bye.